The second headstone had my grandfather's full name carved into weathered granite: Thomas William Parker, 1932–1997, marking a grave in a small cemetery behind Reedy Branch Baptist Church, just outside Boone, North Carolina, less than 2 miles from the family farm where my grandfather had supposedly been buried in 1997 after dying from complications of emphysema. I discovered the grave by accident while researching local history for a genealogy project, scrolling through digitized cemetery records on a Saturday afternoon in April 2024, when I'd noticed an entry that matched my grandfather's name and dates exactly, listed in a cemetery I'd never heard our family mention despite it being within walking distance of property the Parkers had owned for 4 generations. The discovery made no sense because I'd attended my grandfather's funeral in 1997, had stood beside his grave at Parker Family Cemetery on our farm, while the minister read prayers and family members had thrown handfuls of red clay onto the casket, and I had clear memories of visiting that grave with my grandmother over the years before her death in 2015, when she'd been buried beside the man she'd been married to for 48 years. The cemetery record listed Thomas William Parker as buried in Plot 14B at Reedy Branch Cemetery, interred September 1997, with a modest granite marker, and no indication of family members or additional plots purchased nearby. I drove to Boone the following weekend, found the church and its small cemetery on a hillside overlooking the Watauga River, and located the grave exactly where the records indicated it should be. The headstone was simple and slightly weathered, showing nearly 3 decades of exposure to mountain weather, and the inscription included not just my grandfather's name and dates, but also a phrase that struck me as significant: "Beloved husband and father, at rest in the mountains he loved." The language was similar to what appeared on my grandfather's other headstone at the family cemetery, suggesting that whoever had arranged this burial had known him well enough to echo sentiments that our family had chosen for his official marker, and the fact that both graves existed within 2 miles of each other raised questions about which one actually contained my grandfather's body and what the other grave represented. Boone sits high in the Blue Ridge Mountains of western North Carolina, a college town built around Appalachian State University and surrounded by the highest peaks east of the Mississippi, a landscape of steep ridges and narrow valleys where communities have remained relatively isolated despite modern transportation networks. The town has grown considerably since my grandfather's time, student housing and tourist infrastructure expanding into formerly rural areas. But the outskirts still retain the character of traditional Appalachian settlements where families have lived on the same land for generations, and where churches and cemeteries serve as anchors of community identity and continuity. By the time I started investigating my grandfather's second grave, much of the Boone area had been transformed by development associated with the university and with the ski industry that had brought jobs and money to the region. But pockets of older settlement patterns remained visible in valleys and on ridgetops, where property had stayed in the same families for decades, and where change came slowly if it came at all. If you want to discover why my grandfather has 2 graves less than 2 miles apart, and which one actually contains his body, subscribe now, because what I found in Boone will reveal the secret families that exist just beyond the edges of what we think we know, and the reasons people maintain parallel lives in the same communities where their official families believe they know the whole truth. The records at the Watauga County Courthouse showed that the plot at Reedy Branch Cemetery had been purchased in 1995 by someone named Margaret Ann Whitley, paid for in cash with instructions that it be held for Thomas Parker, who was listed as Margaret's husband on the purchase documents. I found a death certificate filed in Watauga County for Thomas William Parker, showing that he died September 18, 1997, at a private residence on Bamboo Road in Boone. Cause of death listed as respiratory failure due to emphysema, body released to Tester Funeral Home for burial at Reedy Branch Cemetery. The date of death matched what I knew about my grandfather's death, but the location was wrong because our family had always been told that my grandfather had died at the Regional Medical Center in Boone after being transported from our farm, when his breathing had become critical, and his body had supposedly been released to a different funeral home that had handled the burial at our family cemetery. I requested the death certificate that our family had used for estate purposes in 1997, and comparing the 2 documents revealed that they were nearly identical except for the location of death and the funeral home involved, suggesting that someone had either created a false death certificate or that my grandfather had somehow been pronounced dead twice and had been buried in 2 different locations. The funeral home listed on the Reedy Branch death certificate was still in operation, and when I called and asked about their records for Thomas Parker from 1997, the current director said they'd handled that burial and that the family contact had been Margaret Whitley, who'd made all the arrangements and had paid in cash for a simple service with no visitation and burial at Reedy Branch Cemetery. The director said the service had been attended by perhaps a dozen people, a small gathering that had seemed appropriate for someone the family had described as private and not wanting a large funeral, and nothing about the arrangements had seemed unusual or had raised questions about the identity of the deceased or the legitimacy of the burial. I searched for Margaret Whitley in property records and found that she'd owned a house on Bamboo Road from 1978 until 2015, when the property had been sold by her estate after her death at age 74. The house had been a modest ranch on 5 acres, assessed at a value that suggested comfortable but not wealthy circumstances, and the deed showed that Margaret had purchased it as a single woman with no co-buyer listed, despite the cemetery records indicating she'd been married to Thomas E. Parker. I drove to Bamboo Road and found the property, now owned by a family that had renovated extensively and had added outbuildings and fencing that changed the character of what had been there when Margaret had owned it. The current owners said they'd bought the house from Margaret's estate and had never met her, but neighbors on both sides had lived on Bamboo Road since the 1980s and remembered Margaret Whitley as a quiet woman who'd kept to herself and who'd been visited regularly by a man, who neighbors had assumed was her husband or partner, though Margaret had never explicitly identified their relationship. One neighbor, a woman named Dorothy Chen, said she'd known Margaret casually for more than 30 years and had been friendly with her in the way that rural neighbors are friendly, exchanging pleasantries and occasional favors without developing deep personal relationships or sharing intimate details about their lives. Dorothy said the man who'd visited Margaret regularly had been around frequently during the 1980s and 1990s, had driven a truck that Dorothy remembered as belonging to someone who worked outdoors or in construction, and had seemed comfortable and at home on Margaret's property in ways that suggested long familiarity rather than casual acquaintance. Dorothy said the man had stopped appearing around 1997 or 1998, and when she'd asked Margaret about him, Margaret had said quietly that he'd passed away, and Dorothy had offered condolences without pressing for details about who the man had been or what his relationship to Margaret had been. Dorothy said Margaret had seemed diminished after the man's death, had become even more private and withdrawn, and had rarely left her property except for necessities like grocery shopping and medical appointments. Dorothy had invited Margaret to church events and community gatherings over the years, but Margaret had always declined politely and had made it clear she preferred solitude to socializing, and Dorothy had respected that preference and had stopped extending invitations after a while. Dorothy said she'd learned of Margaret's death in 2015 from the estate sale signs that had appeared along Bamboo Road, and she'd attended the sale hoping to find some information about Margaret's life or about the man who'd visited her so regularly. But the items for sale had been impersonal and had revealed nothing about Margaret's relationships or her history beyond what could be inferred from ordinary household belongings accumulated over decades of living alone. I found Margaret Whitley's obituary in the Watauga Democrat archives from March 2015, a brief notice listing her as survived by a daughter named Sarah Whitley Morrison living in Tennessee, preceded in death by her parents and by her partner Thomas Parker, who the obituary said had been the love of her life and who died in 1997. The reference to Thomas Parker as Margaret's partner rather than as her husband suggested that their relationship had existed outside of legal marriage, which raised questions about how my grandfather could have been married to my grandmother while also being in a partnership with Margaret that had lasted long enough for Margaret to identify him as the love of her life and to purchase a burial plot where they could be together after death. I found contact information for Sarah Whitley Morrison through social media and sent her a message explaining that I was Thomas Parker's granddaughter and that I'd discovered her mother's obituary mentioned him, and asking if she'd be willing to talk with me about the relationship between Thomas and Margaret and about what had happened in the years before his death. Sarah called me 3 days later, and the first thing she said was that she'd wondered when someone from Thomas's family would eventually find out about his relationship with her mother, that she'd expected someone to discover the grave at Reedy Branch Cemetery, or to find some other evidence of the parallel life Thomas had maintained in Boone, while also living with his family on their farm, just 2 miles away. Sarah said she'd grown up knowing Thomas as her mother's partner, and as the closest thing to a father figure she'd had after her biological father had left when she was an infant, that Thomas had been a regular presence in their household from her earliest memories, and had lived with her mother full-time during the final years of his life, when his health had been declining, and he'd needed more care than he could receive while maintaining his other household. She said she'd understood from a young age that Thomas had another family, that he'd been married to someone else and had children and grandchildren who knew nothing about Sarah or about Margaret, and that the arrangement had seemed normal to her because it was all she'd known and because Thomas and her mother had presented it as a necessary complication rather than as something unusual or wrong. I asked Sarah if she would meet with me to talk about Thomas and Margaret and about the years they'd spent together, and she agreed to drive from Tennessee to meet me in Boone at a restaurant near the university. When we sat down, she showed me photographs of Thomas with her mother spanning nearly 30 years. Images that documented a relationship that had clearly been central to both their lives, even if it had existed in the shadows of Thomas's official marriage. The photographs showed Thomas at birthday parties and holidays, helping with home repairs and yard work, looking comfortable and relaxed in ways I rarely remembered seeing him during family gatherings at the Parker farm. Sarah said Thomas had been loving and attentive to her mother, had treated Margaret with respect and tenderness that Sarah had only later recognized as unusual when she'd started dating, and had realized that many men didn't show that kind of consistent care and consideration toward their partners. Sarah told me that Thomas had met her mother in the mid-1960s when they'd both been working at a furniture factory in Lenoir, that they'd been attracted to each other immediately, but that Thomas had been married and had made it clear from the beginning that he wouldn't leave his wife and children for a new relationship. Margaret had accepted those terms, Sarah said, had decided that having Thomas in her life part-time was better than not having him at all, and they'd maintained that arrangement for more than 30 years, through Margaret's pregnancy with Sarah in 1970, and through all the challenges of raising a child while knowing that child's father could never fully acknowledge her or provide the kind of public support and recognition that children of married parents received automatically. Sarah said she'd resented Thomas occasionally during her childhood, had wished he could attend her school events, or that she could introduce him as her father rather than as her mother's friend, but that she'd understood the constraints he was operating under, and had appreciated the time and attention he'd given her, even if it had been limited by his other obligations. I asked Sarah if Thomas had supported her and Margaret financially, if he'd contributed to household expenses and to Sarah's upbringing in ways that went beyond just being present occasionally, and she said Thomas had been generous with money and had helped pay for the house on Bamboo Road, and had covered Sarah's education expenses, and had made sure Margaret was comfortable, even though he'd had to manage those contributions carefully to avoid his wife discovering unexplained expenses that would have raised questions about where his money was going. Sarah said she'd learned later that Thomas had told his wife he was making investments in timberland and in rental properties, explanations that had apparently been plausible enough that his wife had never questioned the flow of money out of their household, or had investigated whether those investments actually existed. Sarah said the deception had required careful record-keeping and consistent stories maintained across decades, and she'd been impressed by Thomas's ability to manage that complexity while also being present enough in both his family's lives that he didn't seem completely absent or neglectful to either household. Sarah showed me letters Thomas had written to her mother over the years, correspondence that revealed deep affection and genuine commitment despite the constraints of their relationship. And in reading those letters, I recognized my grandfather's handwriting and his way of expressing himself, but saw a vulnerability and emotional openness that I'd never witnessed in his interactions with our family. Thomas had written about loving Margaret and wishing he could give her more than stolen hours and hidden affection, about regretting that Sarah had to grow up without publicly acknowledged father, and about hoping that someday circumstances would change and allow him to be more open about the family he'd created with Margaret, even though he knew that revelation would destroy his marriage and his standing in the community, where the Parker family had deep roots and strong reputations to maintain. The letters made it clear that Thomas had been conflicted about his double life, that he'd recognized the harm his choices were causing to everyone involved, but that he'd been unable or unwilling to give up either family or to force the confrontation that honesty would have required. I asked Sarah what had happened during the final years of Thomas's life, how he'd managed the logistics of dying and being buried when he'd had two families that would both expect to be involved in funeral arrangements and burial decisions. And she said Thomas's health had declined rapidly in 1996 and 1997 as his emphysema had worsened. She said Thomas had moved into Margaret's house full-time in early 1997, had told his wife that he needed to stay in Boone near better medical facilities, and that commuting back to the farm was too difficult given his breathing problems, and apparently my grandmother had accepted that explanation and had visited him in Boone occasionally, without discovering that he was living with Margaret, rather than in some temporary housing arrangement near the hospital.
Sarah said Thomas had died at Margaret's house in September 1997, and Margaret had handled the burial arrangements at Reedy Branch Cemetery according to plans Thomas had made before his death, and apparently someone else had handled parallel burial arrangements that had resulted in my grandfather being buried at the family cemetery as well.
I asked Sarah if she knew whose body was actually in which grave, if Thomas was buried at Reedy Branch Cemetery or at Parker Family Cemetery, or if somehow both graves contained remains that had been claimed as Thomas Parker. And Sarah said she'd always assumed her mother had buried Thomas at Reedy Branch, and that the other burial had been symbolic or had involved someone else's body that Thomas's official family had believed was him. She said her mother had never discussed the details of what had happened after Thomas's death, had seemed to want to avoid talking about the funeral or the burial or the immediate aftermath of losing someone who'd been the center of her life for 3 decades, and Sarah had respected that privacy and had never pushed for information that Margaret clearly didn't want to share. Sarah said she'd visited her mother's grave at Reedy Branch Cemetery occasionally over the years since Margaret's death, and each time she'd seen Thomas's headstone next to Margaret's, she'd felt grateful that they were together finally, without the secrecy and the division that had characterized their relationship during life. I called my father and asked him about the circumstances of my grandfather's death and burial, whether there was anything unusual about the funeral arrangements or about the body that had been buried at Parker Family Cemetery. And my father said everything had seemed normal at the time, though looking back he realized there had been some oddities he'd attributed to the stress and confusion that surrounds death and funeral planning. My father said my grandfather's body had been at the funeral home in a closed casket because the funeral director had said that the emphysema and the final hours of respiratory distress had left him in a condition where viewing wouldn't be advisable. And the family had accepted that explanation and had focused on the memorial service rather than on seeing the body one final time. My father said the casket had felt lighter than expected when he and my uncles had served as pallbearers, but he'd assumed that was because emphysema had wasted my grandfather's body, and because grief was making everything feel surreal and disconnected from normal physical reality. I asked my father if he'd ever had any suspicions that my grandfather might have had another family, or another life beyond what they'd known about, and he said my grandfather had been private and had spent a lot of time away from the farm on what he'd claimed were business trips or visits to check on timber investments, but that those absences had seemed normal for someone who'd been managing multiple income streams and who'd needed to travel to handle his various business interests. My father said he'd never questioned my grandfather's explanations or wondered where he really went during those trips, had trusted that his father was doing what he said he was doing, and had never imagined that the reality might be completely different from what they'd been told. Learning now that my grandfather had maintained a second family just 2 miles away for decades made my father question everything he remembered about his childhood and about the man he'd thought he'd known. And he said he felt betrayed, not just by the secrecy, but by the proximity, by the fact that his father had been maintaining this other life so close to their farm that they could have encountered Margaret or Sarah at any time if circumstances had aligned differently. I hired a forensic genealogist to investigate the death certificates and burial records to determine if there were any irregularities that would suggest fraud or identity confusion, and she came back with information that both death certificates appeared to be legitimate documents filed through proper channels, but that they documented 2 different deaths occurring on the same date to people with the same name and birth date. The genealogist said it was possible that someone had filed a false death certificate using my grandfather's information, or that 2 different people named Thomas William Parker, born in 1932, had coincidentally died on the same day in the same county, but that the more likely explanation was that my grandfather's death had been reported twice through different channels, and that the bureaucratic systems hadn't caught the duplication. She said determining which burial actually contained my grandfather's body would require exhumation and DNA testing, a process that would be expensive and traumatic and that might not even be possible without court orders and cooperation from family members who might not want to know the truth. I visited both graves on the same afternoon, driving first to Parker Family Cemetery on our farm, where my grandfather's official headstone stood beside my grandmother's in the family plot that held 4 generations of Parkers. The grave looked undisturbed and well-maintained, the grass trimmed and the headstone clean, and standing there I tried to imagine whether my grandfather's body was actually 6 feet below me, or whether this was an empty grave that had been treated as sacred ground for 27 years based on a fiction that someone had created to maintain my grandfather's double life, even after his death. I drove to Reedy Branch Cemetery and stood at the second grave, looking at the headstone that bore my grandfather's name and the phrase about resting in the mountains he loved. And I felt certain somehow that this was the real burial site, that this was where Thomas Parker had been laid to rest by the woman who'd loved him for 30 years and who'd wanted him near her, even in death. The church records at Reedy Branch Baptist showed that Margaret Whitley had been a member since 1978, had attended services regularly, and had participated in women's fellowship groups, and had been regarded as a valued member of the congregation, even though she'd rarely talked about her personal life or about her family situation. The current pastor had only been at the church since 2010 and hadn't known Margaret personally, but he connected me with retired pastor James Mitchell, who'd served the congregation from 1975 until 2005, and who remembered Margaret well. Pastor Mitchell said Margaret had been devoted and faithful, had supported the church financially, and had volunteered for various service projects, but had maintained privacy about her personal relationships in ways that had sometimes made church members curious about her circumstances. He said he'd performed Margaret's funeral in 2015 and had been struck by how few people had attended, just Sarah and a handful of church members who'd known Margaret casually, and by how little he'd actually known about Margaret's life, despite having been her pastor for more than 2 decades. Pastor Mitchell said he'd known that Margaret had a partner who wasn't her husband in any legal sense, that Thomas had attended church with Margaret occasionally during the 1980s and early 1990s, though he'd never joined the church or become involved in any activities beyond attending Sunday services when he was in town. Pastor Mitchell said he'd counseled Margaret about her relationship with Thomas, had gently suggested that living together without being married was inconsistent with the church's teachings about Christian relationships, but Margaret had explained that Thomas was married to someone else, and that their relationship existed in a complicated space that traditional church teaching didn't adequately address. Pastor Mitchell said he'd struggled with how to respond to that situation, had wanted to support Margaret as a member of his congregation while also upholding the church's moral standards, and he'd eventually decided that Margaret's faithfulness and her commitment to Christian service were more important than enforcing strict compliance with marriage conventions that didn't account for the messiness of real human relationships. I asked Pastor Mitchell if he'd known that Thomas Parker was buried in the church cemetery, if he'd been aware that the man had a grave there despite also presumably being buried elsewhere with his legal family, and Pastor Mitchell said he'd conducted Thomas's burial service in 1997 at Margaret's request and had known that the situation was unusual, but hadn't asked too many questions about the details. He said Margaret had been grief-stricken at Thomas's death, had seemed to age a decade in the weeks following his passing, and Pastor Mitchell had focused on providing pastoral care and support rather than on investigating the logistics of how a man could be buried in 2 places, or on judging the choices Margaret and Thomas had made during their years together. Pastor Mitchell said he'd wondered occasionally about whether Thomas's official family knew about Margaret and Sarah, had assumed they probably didn't given the secrecy that had characterized the relationship, but he'd decided that preserving Margaret's privacy and respecting her grief were more important than satisfying his curiosity about family dynamics that weren't really his business. My grandmother had died in 2015, the same year as Margaret Whitley, and I wondered if that timing was coincidental, or if there was some connection between the deaths of the 2 women who'd loved the same man and who'd shared him across decades without either apparently knowing the full extent of the other's relationship with Thomas. My grandmother's journals from the 1990s showed a woman who'd been devoted to her husband even as his health declined, who'd accepted his explanations for his absences and his need to stay in Boone near medical facilities, and who'd visited him there without apparently discovering that he was living with another woman rather than in some temporary medical housing. My grandmother had written about her concern for Thomas's health, about her frustration with the distance that had grown between them during his final years, and about her sadness that he'd seemed more comfortable in Boone than on the farm where they'd built their life together and where she'd expected him to want to spend his final days. The entries from September 1997 documented my grandmother's grief at Thomas's death, her shock at how quickly he'd declined and how suddenly he'd passed, and her confusion about why she'd been called to the hospital too late to say goodbye and why the funeral home had recommended a closed casket. My grandmother had written that something had felt wrong about the entire situation, that she'd had nagging doubts about whether she'd been told the complete truth about the circumstances of Thomas's death, but that she'd pushed those doubts aside because questioning them would have meant confronting possibilities she wasn't ready to face. She'd written that she'd chosen to believe the official story, to accept that her husband had died as she'd been told, and to focus on honoring his memory, rather than on investigating suspicions that might have revealed truths she'd prefer not to know. Reading those entries now, knowing what I knew about Margaret and Sarah and the second grave, I wondered if my grandmother had suspected more than she'd admitted even to herself in her private journals. I found receipts among my grandfather's papers showing regular cash withdrawals from the farm's bank account during the 1980s and 1990s, amounts that would have been substantial enough to support a second household, but that had been labeled as timber expenses or property maintenance in the ledgers my grandmother had kept for tax purposes. The amounts had increased during the 1990s, as my grandfather's health had declined, and as presumably Margaret's expenses had increased with having to care for someone who could no longer work and who needed ongoing medical attention. The final withdrawal had been in August 1997, just weeks before my grandfather's death, a large sum that might have been used to prepay funeral expenses or to ensure Margaret would be financially stable after Thomas was gone and could no longer contribute to household costs. My father and his siblings were shocked and hurt when I told them what I'd discovered about their father's double life, about Margaret and Sarah and the second grave at Reedy Branch Cemetery, and they struggled with how to process the information and what to do about it. My uncle wanted to have the grave at Reedy Branch exhumed, wanted to prove that their father was buried at the family cemetery where he belonged, rather than at some church cemetery with a woman who'd been his mistress rather than his wife. But my aunt argued that exhumation would be disrespectful and traumatic and wouldn't change the fact that their father had betrayed their mother and had maintained a secret family for decades. My father was caught between those positions, wanting to know the truth, but also fearing that investigating too thoroughly would reveal things that would make the betrayal feel even worse. And he said he wasn't sure that knowing which grave actually contained his father's body would provide any comfort or closure that would be worth the process of digging up graves and testing remains. We decided as a family to reach out to Sarah and to acknowledge her as our half-sister, to try to build some kind of relationship with her that honored the fact that she was Thomas Parker's daughter, even if the circumstances of her birth and upbringing had been hidden from us. Sarah was receptive but cautious, said she'd spent her entire life as the secret child and wasn't sure how to exist as an acknowledged member of the Parker family, and that she needed time to process what it would mean to be recognized by siblings she'd grown up not knowing existed even though they'd lived less than 2 miles away for most of her childhood. We met at the farm, and I watched Sarah walk the property where her father had lived his official life, and she said it felt strange to see the place she'd heard about but had never visited. To stand in the house where her father had slept in a different bed beside a different woman and had lived a completely separate version of his life from the one he'd shared with Sarah and Margaret. My father showed Sarah photographs of Thomas from throughout his life, images that created a timeline parallel to the one Sarah had from her own collection, and laying the photographs side by side revealed a man who'd been living simultaneously in 2 worlds that never touched, except in his own mind, where he'd had to maintain the boundaries and keep the stories straight across thousands of interactions over 3 decades. Sarah asked what our grandfather had been like, whether he'd been a good father to his legitimate children, and my father said Thomas had been present but emotionally distant, had provided for the family financially, but had seemed preoccupied and distracted in ways that made sense now knowing he'd been managing a double life and dividing his attention between two families who'd each deserved his full commitment and presence. Sarah said her mother had told her that Thomas had talked about telling his official family the truth someday, about bringing Margaret and Sarah into the open and acknowledging them as part of his family, but that he'd never found the courage or the right moment to make that revelation. Margaret had apparently hoped that after Thomas's wife died, he would finally be free to marry her and to publicly acknowledge Sarah. But Thomas had died before my grandmother, and that possibility had never materialized. Sarah said her mother had carried the sadness of being the secret woman for her entire adult life, had accepted that role because loving Thomas had seemed worth the price of remaining hidden, but that the cost had been higher than either of them had probably acknowledged at the time. Margaret had died alone except for Sarah, had never remarried or found another partner after Thomas's death, and Sarah said she thought her mother had believed that no other relationship could compare to what she'd had with Thomas, even if that relationship had existed in the shadows and had required constant secrecy. The question of which grave actually contains my grandfather's body remains unresolved. Neither family willing to pursue exhumation and DNA testing that would definitively answer that question, but that would also require disturbing graves that have been undisturbed for decades. Sarah believes her mother buried Thomas at Reedy Branch Cemetery and that the Parker family cemetery grave is empty or contains someone else's remains, while my father holds to the belief that his father is buried on the family farm where he belongs and that the Reedy Branch grave is symbolic or commemorative rather than an actual burial. I've come to think that it doesn't matter ultimately where the physical remains are located, that both graves represent real aspects of who my grandfather was and how he lived, and that the truth of his double life exists regardless of which plot of ground contains his body. The house on Bamboo Road where my grandfather spent his final years with Margaret has been completely transformed by its current owners. The modest ranch expanded and renovated in ways that erase any trace of the life that was lived there when Margaret owned the property. I've driven past it several times, tried to imagine my grandfather in that house during his final months, breathing with difficulty and knowing he was dying, and making arrangements for burial at Reedy Branch Cemetery, where he'd be close to Margaret after death, even though they'd had to maintain distance during life. The neighbors who remember Margaret and Thomas have mostly died or moved away, and the current residents of Bamboo Road know nothing about the secret relationship that was maintained in that house for 30 years, or about the man who lived there, while also maintaining a family just 2 miles away on Parker land. The Parker family farm remains in our family, worked now by my cousin, who's continued the cattle operation my grandfather started in the 1960s, and the family cemetery sits on a hillside, overlooking pastures that have been in the Parker family for more than a century. My grandmother's grave beside my grandfather's headstone represents a marriage that lasted 48 years, and standing there knowing what I now know about Margaret and Sarah doesn't change the fact that my grandmother believed she was married to Thomas Parker completely and exclusively for all those decades. The reality that her marriage had existed alongside another relationship that had lasted just as long and had been just as important to Thomas is a truth that my grandmother died without knowing, and I'm uncertain whether that ignorance was a mercy that protected her from pain, or a betrayal that denied her the right to know the truth about the man she'd spent her life with. Sarah visits both graves occasionally, places flowers at Reedy Branch Cemetery where she believes her father is buried, and also at Parker Family Cemetery where his official family believes he rests. And she says that ritual helps her acknowledge both parts of her father's life and both families that loved him, despite his deception and his inability to choose one over the other. She's developed relationships with her half-siblings, my father and my aunt and uncle, connections that have grown slowly and carefully as everyone navigates the complicated feelings about discovering family they never knew existed, and about learning that their father had been capable of sustaining such elaborate deception across decades. Sarah's daughter has met my children, cousins who share a grandfather, but who grew up in completely different circumstances, one side knowing Thomas as their grandmother's husband, and the other knowing him as their grandmother Margaret's partner, and watching those cousins try to reconcile their different understandings of the same person has been both painful and fascinating. The church at Reedy Branch Baptist still holds services every Sunday, and I've attended a few times to feel connected to the place where my grandfather was buried according to his wishes, or at least according to Margaret's understanding of what he would have wanted. The current congregation knows nothing about the complicated history behind the grave in their cemetery, sees it as just another headstone marking another life that passed through their community. And the pastor who conducts services there never knew Thomas or Margaret, and has no context for understanding the double life that ended with burial in Plot 14B. I've thought about telling the church the full story, about explaining that the grave they maintain represents a secret family and a relationship that existed outside of legal marriage for 30 years. But I've decided that information serves no purpose except to satisfy curiosity, and that respecting Margaret's privacy and her choice to keep her relationship with Thomas quiet is more important than correcting the historical record. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next investigation where we uncover the second graves that reveal secret families and discover the parallel lives that people maintained in the same communities where their official families believed they knew the whole truth about who their loved ones were and how they spent their time.